There's a particular kind of knowledge that arrives not through research or warning, but through duration. You cannot be told what 3 nights in a certain kind of place will teach you. The information doesn't travel that way. It has to accumulate inside the body, the way cold does. Not as a single event, but as a gradual revision of what you thought. This is not a story about a haunting. Those stories have shapes you already know, and this one refuses that shape. What happened to Wren Siu across 3 nights in a 4th floor flat in an older district of the city is better described as an education. Slow, structurally precise, and final in the way that certain kinds of understanding are final, not because they end things, but because they make certain directions permanently unavailable. Wren was 31 when she signed the lease. She had been looking for 3 months, which in this city means she had been losing money for 3 months. The gap between what her previous landlord had decided her room was worth and what her current income could sustain had become a number she tracked daily, the way people track symptoms. She was a copy editor for a logistics firm, working from home 4 days a week, which meant that where she lived was also where she worked, which meant that the cost of a flat wasn't just a personal expense, but a professional one, a structural one, a kind that justifies a slightly different calculation when the number on the listing seems... You use the word she would use later, irregular. The flat on Heung Po Street was listed at a figure that required her to look at it twice. Not dramatically low. Nothing that would have activated simple suspicion. Just low enough that she refreshed the page twice to confirm the digit hadn't shifted. 2 bedrooms, which she didn't need, but wouldn't refuse. Windows on the east and north faces. A kitchen that faced the light well. 4th floor of a 6th floor walk-up, built sometime in the late 1960s. Renovated once, in the early 2000s, in the way that renovation was done then. New laminate over old tile, new paint over old plaster, new fixtures attached to pipes that nobody looked at. The agent who showed her the unit was a man named Mr. Tong, who wore shoes that were slightly too formal for the neighborhood, and answered her questions with the particular precision of someone who has learned which questions to answer precisely and which to receive with a kind of generous vagueness. When she asked why the previous tenant had left, he said the previous tenant had relocated for work. When she asked how long the flat had been vacant, he said not long. When she asked what not long meant, he said a few months, which she would later discover was a compression of something closer to 11. She noticed the windows on the first visit, though she did not think about them as something to notice. They were the kind of windows common to buildings of that era. Aluminum frames, single-pane glass, the sort that open outward on a hinge mechanism that requires a specific grip. She tested one in the living room, the north-facing one, and found that it opened about 4 centimeters before the hinge locked. She tried again, same result. Mr. Tong, standing behind her, said the mechanism had stiffened from disuse and would loosen once she was settled in. She filed this under minor inconvenience and did not return to it. She signed the lease on a Thursday. She moved in the following Saturday, with 2 friends who helped her carry boxes up 4 flights, and then left by early afternoon. By 5 o'clock, she was alone in the flat for the first time, sitting on the floor between stacked boxes, eating a container of food she'd brought from a place near her old neighborhood. The flat was quiet in a way she found pleasant. She had lived below a family with young children for 2 years. Quiet had become something she associated with progress. The first night she slept well, or believed she did. She would qualify this later. Slept in the way that you sleep in a new place when exhaustion overrides unfamiliarity. She woke at her usual time, made tea in the kitchen, and spent the morning unpacking. The flat received morning light through the east-facing bedroom window, which she had opened without difficulty, suggesting Mr. Tong's explanation about the living room window might be accurate. She did not test the living room window again that morning. She was busy. There were things to organize. It was on the second evening that something shifted in the quality of the flat's silence. Not in the silence itself. The building remained quiet. No unusual sounds from neighboring units. No structural settling that she could attribute to a source. What shifted was harder to describe. She was working at her desk near the east window, reading through a document on her screen, when she became aware that the air in the room had a texture she hadn't registered the night before. This is not a precise description, and she knew it wasn't precise, even as she formed it later. The air was the same temperature. The humidity hadn't changed, but there was something about sitting still in that room, and the way you have to sit still when you are reading carefully, that made the room's stillness register differently. As if stillness had a pressure she hadn't calibrated for, she got up and went to the living room window and tried it again. It opened the same 4 centimeters and stopped. She looked at the hinge mechanism. It didn't appear damaged or rusted. The stop seemed intentional, a deliberate limit, not a degradation. She tried the second living room window, which she hadn't tested before. It opened 3 centimeters. She tried the north-facing window in the second bedroom, 2.5. Every window in the flat operated on the same principle. It opened. It provided the suggestion of openness. And then it stopped at a distance that admitted almost no meaningful air exchange. She told herself this was a building regulation. Some cities had rules about window openings in older residential buildings, something to do with fall prevention. She told herself she could look it up. She did not look it up that night because it was already late, and she was tired and the flat was quiet, and none of this felt urgent. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the building and heard nothing that should have kept her awake. She was awake for a long time regardless. The third night is where the title earns its structure, but understanding what happened on the third night requires understanding what she did on the third day, because the knowledge didn't arrive in darkness. It arrived in a government office on the other side of the district at 2:15 in the afternoon, in a room with fluorescent lighting and rows of metal chairs, while she waited 40 minutes to speak to a clerk about a utility transfer. She had brought her tenancy agreement to have a section of it stamped. While waiting, she was sitting next to an older woman named Mrs. Chung, who had the kind of patience with bureaucratic waiting that comes from long practice, and who, after 20 minutes of companionable silence, noticed the address on the document Wren was holding and made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. Wren asked what the sound meant. Mrs. Chung asked which floor. Wren said 4. Counter Chung looked at the form in her own lap and said, in the careful tone of someone deciding how much to hand to a stranger, that she had a neighbor whose sister-in-law had lived in that building. Mrs. Chung was quiet for a moment. Then she asked which unit, and Wren told her, and Mrs. past tense. Wren asked when. Mrs. Chung said she wasn't sure of the year, but that it had been during a Yulon period, which Wren knew as the 7th lunar month. The period sometimes called Ghost Month in translation, though that translation compresses something more structurally specific into something more dramatically legible than it actually is. During Yulon, the membrane between accumulated yin energy and the living environment is understood, in certain cosmological frameworks, to behave differently, not because anything enters from outside, but because what is already gathered inside becomes more present, more organized, in a sense, more directional. Mrs. Chung's neighbor's sister-in-law had left the flat mid-lease, which was financially painful because she had begun to experience something she couldn't explain in terms that satisfied either a doctor or a landlord. Not visions, not sounds. A quality in the air that she described as weight, a sense, most acute at night, that the room was not exchanging itself, that the same air was being breathed in cycles without dilution, without the small turbulence of outside contact that keeps a space from becoming sealed around its own content. Wren asked about the windows. Mrs. Chung looked at her directly. She said, "So you've tried them?" The conversation lasted another 8 minutes before Mrs. Chung was called to the counter. In those 8 minutes, Wren learned that the building had a history she could have found if she had known to look, or if Mr. Tong had volunteered the direction. In the 1990s, the flat had been occupied by a family of 4 for 11 years. The father had died in the flat, a sudden event. Cardiac, not protracted, but still, a death inside the unit, which in certain frameworks of understanding leaves a residue that isn't supernatural in the Western dramatic sense, but is, rather, the yin energy of a sudden departure, particularly from a space that the departed had occupied with sustained intensity. Doesn't dissipate the way temperature does, it settles. It accumulates in corners and along walls and in the movement patterns where a person's habitual routes through a space leave something that resembles, without being, a groove. The windows, Mrs. Chung explained, or rather, offered, in the tone of someone sharing a piece of information whose completeness she wasn't guaranteeing. The windows in buildings with this kind of history are sometimes sealed deliberately. Not to trap anything. The logic doesn't work that way. The sealing is about controlling the flow, the way qi moves through a space. An unsealed window in a unit with significant yin accumulation creates a corridor, a path for that energy to travel, to become mobile in ways that affect the living inhabitants more directly. A sealed window, or a window limited to minimal opening, keeps the distribution more stable, more contained. The presence doesn't leave, but it also doesn't circulate. She was called to the... Wren sat with this for the remaining 12 minutes of her own wait. That evening, she returned to the flat with a different awareness than she'd had before. Not fear exactly, something more structural than fear. She walked through each room and looked at the windows with the understanding that they hadn't been sealed by neglect or regulation or a landlord's indifference to his tenants' comfort. They had been sealed, or rather, limited, by someone who knew the building's history and had made a calculation. The calculation was, a tenant who doesn't know will not ask, and a tenant who asks can be told the mechanism has stiffened. The discount in the rent was not generosity. It was the cost of non-disclosure presented as a price reduction. She sat in the living room for a long time without turning on additional lights. The flat silence, which on the first night had felt like progress and on the second had begun to feel like pressure, now felt like something she could name more accurately. A room that doesn't exchange its air with the outside is a room that keeps itself. It keeps its temperature because the walls hold it. It keeps its sound because the surfaces don't interrupt it. And it keeps, if you accept the cosmological framework Mrs. Chung had offered without endorsing, what has been released inside it by the lives that moved through it and the one that ended inside it. Wren was not a person who organized her understanding of the world around spiritual frameworks. She had grown up in a household where these things were present, the way furniture is present, not consciously arranged, but structurally there, informing the layout without being discussed. She knew what Yulan month meant. She knew what yin accumulation meant. She had not thought about these things in years, because she had not needed to, because she had been living in spaces where they were not relevant. The relevance of a framework becomes apparent when you enter its field. She opened her laptop and searched for the building's address alongside terms. She wasn't entirely comfortable searching. What she found was limited. There was no publicly accessible record of what Mrs. Chung had described, but she found a community forum post from 2009 in which someone mentioned the building on Heung Po Street in a thread about properties with histories in the district. The post said only that a particular unit on the upper floors had had multiple short tenancies through the late 90s and early 2000s, and that locals in the neighborhood knew something about the building that the property listings didn't include. The post had 7 replies. One of them said, "Those windows have been like that for years, and everyone on the street knows why." Another said, "My uncle lived 1 floor below and moved out because the ceiling above him felt wrong." The thread was 15 years old. No one had replied to it in over a decade. She found, through a property database, she had to pay a small fee to access a record of tenancy durations in her unit, going back to Lansenini. The pattern was consistent. No tenancy longer than 14 months, most ending between the 8 and 11-month mark, 2 lasting less than 6 months. The one before hers had lasted 11 months and ended, according to the database, with a tenant listed as having relocated. The same phrasing Mr. Tong had used. Relocated is a word that doesn't ask you to specify what you are relocating from or what it costs you to leave before your lease expires. There is a specific kind of financial logic that operates in rental markets around properties with histories. The landlord is aware. The discount in the listing price is the market's way of processing information that isn't legally required to be disclosed. Or rather, in some jurisdictions, is required to be disclosed, but only for deaths that occurred within a certain number of years. And the death in this building's history was old enough to have passed through that window of required transparency and into the quieter zone of optional mention. The price reduction was real. The reason for it was real. The connection between the two was the thing that Mr. Tong's precision had been organized around not establishing. Wren understood this completely by the third night. And understanding it changed the texture of the silence again, not into something more frightening, into something more honest. She was sitting in a flat that cost less than it should because someone had died in it, because the windows had been restricted in response to a cosmological framework that the landlord apparently took seriously enough to act on without being willing to mention, and because the accumulation of yin energy in a sealed space, whatever that meant in terms of measurable physics, whatever its actual mechanism, was apparently sufficient to cause 11 consecutive tenants to leave early. She was the 12th. She lay in bed that night and felt the room's stillness with new precision. The air had a quality she now understood was not metaphorical. It wasn't that the air was thick with anything narratively satisfying. It was that air in a sealed space has a relationship with itself. That air in an exchanged space doesn't. It has memory. It holds the sea, all of your exhalations. It holds temperature without releasing it. It holds, if you want to use the language Mrs. Chung had offered carefully and without insisting on it, the energetic residue of the lives that has been inside. A room that cannot breathe keeps its own history in ways that a room with open windows disperses into the larger atmosphere. She did not see anything that night. She did not hear anything. She did not experience anything that a recording device would have captured. What she experienced was the full arrival of understanding. The moment when the structure of a situation becomes completely visible, and you have to decide what to do with the visibility. She thought about the cost of breaking the lease. The tenancy agreement had a clause for early termination that required 2 months' rent, paid as penalty plus forfeiture of the deposit. She calculated this against the discount she'd received relative to market rate and found that the math was essentially neutral. The savings she'd accumulated by paying below market rate would be almost entirely consumed by the exit cost. The landlord's pricing had been calibrated with a precision that looked generous from the outside and was from the inside. A closed system. You paid the discount when you entered, and you paid it again when you left. The flat was self-financing its own reputation. She thought about staying, not as a resolution, not as a narrative act of defiance, but as a practical question. What is actually happening in the room? The yin accumulation framework was real, in the sense that frameworks are real. It was a structure of interpretation that had been built and refined over centuries by people with more sustained experience of this category of situation than she had. Mrs. Chong's neighbor's sister-in-law had experienced wait. 11 previous tenants had left early. These were data points. Data points don't require supernatural explanation to constitute a pattern, but they also don't require rational dismissal to be taken seriously. She was a copy editor. Her professional function was to find what had been placed in a document that shouldn't be there and what had been omitted that should. She was looking at a document, this flat, this lease, this set of sealed windows, and identifying the structure of what had been placed and what had been omitted. She decided she would stay 2 more weeks, not because she was brave, and not because she was in denial, but because she wanted to understand the difference between what the room was and what she was afraid it might become. This is a specific kind of epistemic discipline that doesn't get discussed much in conversations about fear, because it requires tolerating uncertainty without resolving it in either direction. Over those 2 weeks, she did 3 things. She contacted a practitioner through a connection she found in her own family network, an aunt who knew someone who consulted on this category of problem with the matter-of-fact professionalism of someone in a recognized field. The practitioner came on a Tuesday morning, walked through the flat, assessed the window restrictions, noted the history Wren had by now partially documented, and told her that the ceiling was not unintelligent, but that it was insufficient as a standalone measure. He performed a cleansing of the type that doesn't announce itself dramatically. Incense, specific movement through the rooms in a particular sequence, attention to the corners, where accumulation is structurally most likely. He told her the flat wasn't uninhabitable. He also told her that without a proper ritual acknowledgement of the death, something the landlord had apparently never arranged, the conditions that generated the accumulation would continue to generate it, and the sealed windows were managing a symptom rather than the underlying situation. She told the landlord what she'd found, not accusatorially, with the documentation she'd assembled, the tenancy duration records, the forum post, the practitioner's assessment. She presented it as information rather than grievance. The landlord was quiet on the phone for a long time. Then he said, in Cantonese, that the situation had been addressed. She asked when. He said some time ago. She asked what form the addressing had taken. He said these things had been handled. The gap between handled and resolved is a gap that buildings live in for a long time. She left at the end of month 4. The penalty cost her what she'd saved. The deposit was returned, which she hadn't expected, which suggested the landlord understood that the negotiation could go further in directions he preferred. What she carried out of the flat was not a story of survival or escape. It was something closer to a map of the ways that certain kinds of knowledge are withheld inside systems, property systems, disclosure systems, pricing systems, not through any single malicious act, but through the accumulated practice of people choosing what to mention and what to receive with generous vagueness. The flat on Heung Po Street is still listed periodically. The price is still below market rate. The windows are still sealed to 4 centimeters on the north face and 3 on the west. The mechanism has not stiffened from disuse. It was adjusted deliberately by someone who understood something about the space and decided that adjustment was sufficient, and that the person who came next would either not notice or not know what noticing meant. There are buildings in every city that hold information this way, not because they are malevolent in any dramatic sense, because the systems around them, financial, legal, cultural, create conditions where incomplete disclosure is economically rational, and complete disclosure is economically rational, is economically inconvenient, and because the people who move through these systems become, over time, sophisticated about which silences are profitable and which explanations are necessary. The discount is the disclosure. You just have to know what you are being told. Wren now rents a flat on the 7th floor of a newer building in a different district. The windows open fully. She tests them occasionally, not out of anxiety, but out of a practice she has developed around knowing what a space will and won't allow. She said, when describing the 3 nights on Heung Po Street, that she doesn't think about it the way you think about something frightening. She thinks about it the way you think about something you understand. Understanding something doesn't make it comfortable. It makes it finished in a specific way, present in your knowledge, no longer present in your uncertainty. The room is still there. The air in it is still sealed around itself. What was left in it by the life that ended there is still organizing itself in the corners, still doing what accumulated yin energy does in a space that has no corridor outward. The windows stay sealed because opening them fully would change the distribution of something that someone, somewhere in the building's history, decided was better managed than dispersed. Whether that decision was wise or simply convenient depends on what you think management means and what you think dispersal costs and who you think should pay for it. These are not questions with clean answers. They are questions that buildings ask quietly and that most people don't hear until they've been inside long enough for the air to start feeling like something other than air.